Hello and welcome to Class Time, your daily classroom for CSEC students. Watch this lesson in real time on Television Jamaica's YouTube channel or One Spot Media. I'm Vanessa Francis, your CSEC English teacher for today, and today we're focusing on persuasive writing. Let's get started. So we are basically continuing what we have been doing regarding persuasive writing. And today our focus is on transitional phrases and link words. So you need these to move your argument from one point to another seamlessly. So here are our learning objectives. So you should be able to discuss the nature of transitional phrases and link words, of course. You should also be able to differentiate among the various types of transitional phrases and link words. And you should be able to create sentences using transitional phrases and link words. So let's get into it. Now, remember, you're thinking about transitional phrases. So they act like a bridge. So I want you to look at this picture. Two pictures actually. And you decide which bridge would you use. So let's look at the first one. So there's our first bridge. Take a good look at it, look at the features, look at the span and everything. Now, take a look at the next bridge. Big difference. So, of this bridge and this bridge, which would you prefer to use? Which would you feel more confident using? Which one do you think can get you safely from one side to the next? And that is a concept you need to use when you're using your transitional phrases and link words. Which one or which set will get you from one point to the other safely? All right, so let's get into it. So what are transitional words and phrases? Can you think of a definition for them? Bini? All right. So these are words or phrases that connect one thought or idea to the next, as we've been looking at the idea of a bridge. Now, they can be used to connect thoughts in two sentences or to move the reader on to the next paragraph in a logical way. The next thing they can do, they can single out words, phrases, or complete sentences. They can be, single words, phrases, or complete sentences. So your transition doesn't have to be a single word, although it can be. It can be a group of words, or it can be an entire sentence that moves you from one point to the next, one paragraph to the next. So keep this in mind as we go through the exercise. You've heard this before. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And there's what it means. One weak part will render the entire thing weak. So if your transitional phrases don't do the job they're supposed to do in your essay, then it weakens your whole essay. So you might have the best points. You have developed the points well. But moving from point to point, from idea to idea within the same point, if you are weak in doing that, then the whole essay is basically going to look like that second bridge, unraveling. So, time for you to put your transitions to use. And this is a question we're focusing on today. So, school rules violate the personal freedom of students and should be abolished. Write an essay giving your views on this statement. And it was question 8 on the May 2014 CSEC English A paper. Now keep that in mind as we go through. This is a scenario you're using and something simple enough that you can identify with as well. All right, so phrases to support evidence. Oh, and a correction, it's actually school uniforms, not school rules. My bad. So, typical phrases that support evidence. So we're looking at what you would normally use to support evidence. So you would use terms such as, you'd use for example, you would use for instance. So those are the ordinary ones. Those are the ones that come to your mind first. Now, the idea is You want to have a variety and you want some amount of potency in your writing. So these are fine, yes, but if you want the really good marks, then let's look at some that you could use instead and how you could use them instead. So here's our first possibility. So in fact and stands to reason. So those are two. So try and think of a sentence to support or to oppose the concept that we're working with, that uses in fact, that uses stands to reason. Think about that a minute. Now let me show you a possibility. And remember, it's a possibility. You don't have to write it like this because you have your own creative idea, of course. So these are just ideas of how you can go about using these terms. So, in fact, there are no studies to show that wearing uniforms is detrimental to students. So we have used in fact to support some evidence. Now let's look at how we can use stands to reason. It stands to reason that one's right to freedom of expression is severely impeded by being compelled to wear a uniform. So we have used each of these expressions to support evidence. All right? Now let's look at another set of expressions to support evidence. So think about this now. How can you use goes without saying to support evidence? How can you use it can be clearly seen, and that can be in it or perhaps not. So that's why it's in bracket. You can use it with or without depending on the sentence you structure. So let's look at an example now. So the fact that we are all entitled to freedom goes without saying. So you have supported evidence. You have showed that freedom is a must, and that is something that everybody understands. Now for the next one, it can be clearly seen that order can be maintained much easier when uniforms are in play. So the idea is you're saying that this is something everybody knows. So the evidence you're supporting is something that is common knowledge, basically. Let's continue. So here we have another phrase. A typical case is, and we have our word underpin. How could you use a typical case is to support evidence? How could you use underpin? Let's look. A typical case is that of students choosing highly inappropriate clothes to attend school. How can you use underpin? Take a look. The blatant infringement of basic human rights is what underpins the thrust to abolish school uniforms. So in each of those cases, you have supported some kind of evidence and you have used your transitional phrases to show that you're in support of whatever evidence you're showing. So now let's move to phrases that draw conclusions, not to be confused with your concluding paragraph. What you're doing is using a phrase that will make a point. So you're drawing a conclusion based on some things you've said already, you're summing it up, but you're not at the concluding paragraph necessarily. So here are the typical phrases that can be used. You can use as a result, and you could add of, or you could say therefore. Very commonly used phrases, and of course we're trying to steer away from the very commonly used ones because we want to show some amount of understanding and sophistication in our writing. So let's look at some possibilities now. So here are two. It can be clearly seen, or you can use unmistakably. How can you use these two to draw conclusions? What can you do with them in a sentence to draw a conclusion based on the scenario we are working with? All right, so here's a possibility. In the issue of whether or not school uniforms should be abolished, it can be clearly seen that those in support of uniforms are archaic. So you're again stating something that seems like the obvious conclusion to draw. Look at the next way you can draw a conclusion. One needs only observe what students wear outside of school to determine that these fashions, and you put that in quotation marks, will unmistakably be on display in the classroom as well. So again, the conclusion is being drawn that The same way students dress when they are free to dress, that's the way they'll choose to dress when they're in the classroom. So two different conclusions have been drawn using two different expressions. Let's look at another one. Consequently. Do you remember what consequently means? Think of consequence and what that word means. So how would you use consequently now to draw a conclusion? Let's have a look. The youth are subjected to draconian rules and consequently rebel at every opportunity presented to them. So right here, you have drawn the conclusion that because the young people are used to being bullied into obeying different rules, then when they don't have a rule to follow, they'll just go wild and free. So that is a conclusion that is being drawn. Not necessarily an accurate one, but it is still a conclusion. Because remember, you are writing persuasively, so you're trying to convince someone. So you might have to do a bit of exaggeration. We looked at all those devices already. So a little bit of exaggeration might do the trick. So let's move on. So we're looking at phrases now that present an opposing or contrasting view. So remember now, sometimes in your argument, you might want to bring up what your opposition would say. So this is a way you can do that. So the typical phrases we would use now. On the contrary, of course. However, on the other hand, and the dreaded but. Please avoid that word as much as possible. Because if you keep using it over and over and over, it gets very repetitive and it's very simplistic. So try to avoid the words that you see fall under typical phrases, all right? So here are some other alternatives you could use to spice up the writing. So first alternative, against that. Next alternative, in spite of or despite. Think about that. How could you formulate a sentence or a point that presents an opposing or contrasting view using either of these two terms? Ready now? All right, let's see. So, first option for against that, it is believed that a lack of discipline will result in if school uniforms are abolished. Against that is the belief that uniforms do not engender discipline, but rather resentment. So look at how you use against that. You have said, you have made a point. One thing is believed. However, there is another belief that is contrary or contradictory to it. Let's look at how you can use the other transitional expression. Despite beliefs to the contrary, wearing school uniforms does not stifle creativity or self-expression in students. So you have brought in a contrasting view. So perhaps someone would say that this is what uniforms do. However, you are pointing out that that is not the view. That is not the reality. All right, let's continue. So think about using unlike. Think about using nevertheless. So for unlike, here's a possibility. School uniforms are a means of promoting the safety and security of our young ones, unlike casual clothes, which exposes them to unwanted attention from unscrupulous individuals. Interesting. And then look at a possibility for nevertheless. School uniforms are touted as facilitators of discipline. Nevertheless, the rate of disciplinary sanctions is no higher in schools that allow students freedom to choose what to wear. So you have brought in these contradicting viewpoints that will go against your argument, but you're showing how these arguments, these contradicting arguments, are not important to what you are saying. So when you point out that school uniforms are a means of safety as opposed to casual clothes, you are emphasizing the fact that it is safer for you to be wearing a uniform than for you to be out and about in your regular clothes for various reasons. And when you use nevertheless, same thing. You're showing now that even though it is said that the school uniforms help in discipline, right here you're making the point that not necessarily true. This is not necessarily what happens. All right, let's continue. So think about, how would you use whereas? How would you use alternatively? Remember now, you want to present an opposing or a contrasting view. How would you go about doing that with either of these two terms? Think carefully. Whereas, not a very commonly used term, unfortunately. Alternatively, we've heard it, but not necessarily in this type of context. So let's see how you can use them. Wearing casual clothes promotes casual attitudes, whereas wearing a uniform promotes studious attitudes. So you have brought in comparison here. You're comparing the attitudes brought about when you wear uniforms as opposed to the attitudes brought about when you wear what you want to wear. So casual clothes, casual attitudes. For alternatively now, school uniforms are traditional and outdated. Alternatively, abolishing school uniforms is a much overdue step into the 21st century and beyond. So you have brought these two views now. You have shown that one, on the one hand, one idea is traditional, yes, but it is outdated. But on the other hand, alternatively, doing away with the idea will now bring you forward into the future, the present and the future. So you're showing a contrast between past and the views of the past and present and the views of the present. Now, let's look at how you would use differ from or differing from, and how you would use conversely. So think about that now. How can you use differ from or differing from to show an opposing or contrasting view? How could you use conversely to bring in an opposing or contrasting view? Remember now, you're appealing to your opposition. So you have to know how to bring in that contrasting view to actually emphasize the point you want to make. So let's look at a possibility. The complacent students of yesteryear who unquestioningly accepted school uniforms greatly differ from the outspoken woke, in quotation marks, because we know slang terms such as that have to be in quotation marks, the outspoken woke students of today. Now, if you look at that, the idea being conveyed here, of course, you're comparing again the traditional, the old-fashioned, and you are comparing it to the new age, the now, the here. Hence the use of the slang term woke, because that is something that is associated with the now generation. So you're tying in everything to try and boost the point you're making. Now look at conversely. Wearing school uniforms is relatively inexpensive. Conversely, furnishing a wardrobe of on-trend clothes can put undue strain on already faltering finances. So here you are comparing what it costs to wear a uniform as opposed to what it will cost to have a new wardrobe of casual clothes. And of course, the argument can continue, but we're just focusing on this particular point because in truth and in fact, it is valid. So you're comparing the two ideas and showing on your side that wearing a uniform will cost less. So those who are concerned about money, this point will appeal to them. Now, think about how you would use notwithstanding and how you would use nonetheless. Now, these terms are, again, not very common. You don't hear them all the time. But if you're able to use them effectively, imagine what that will do for your writing and your score. So, notwithstanding, even if you don't know the meaning, think about what it possibly could mean. Notwithstanding. Smoosh it together. Notwithstanding. What ideas are coming to your mind about that particular word? And look at nonetheless. Nonetheless. What can that mean? So let's look at the possibilities now. Notwithstanding the need for order and discipline, school uniforms must be abolished. So basically you're saying, yes, we need order and discipline. However, we still need to get rid of the uniforms, because in this point, you're inherently saying that the two don't have anything to do with each other. That's what you're really trying to say. And then let's look at how you use nonetheless. We all enjoy dressing up. Nonetheless, school uniforms should not be abolished. So you've done the opposite now. You have agreed, or you have conceded that yes, everybody likes to dress up in their pretty clothes, quote unquote, but that does not mean you should get rid of school uniforms. So we are going to take a break. More when we return. Welcome back to class time. We are looking at persuasive writing, and today's focus is transitional phrases and link words. So remember, before the break, we were looking at different sets of words that can connect arguments, can connect points, can possibly even connect one paragraph to another. So we're going to continue now. So we're going to look at phrases that show similarities, because many times when making your arguments, you have to draw comparisons that show not just the differences, but the similarities as well. So here are the typical words you would use to show this. So we have a nice long list here. So you have also, similarly, additionally or in addition. You have of course, you have like or likewise, and you have in the same way. So again, there's nothing wrong with using these, just that you want to ensure that you don't only use these words. You want to be practicing and honing your skills so that as you go along, you are improving. So let's look at some alternatives to these words that you could possibly use. So here's an expression, by the same token. Think about that. You might not have heard it before, but since you're going to use it to show similarities, think about how would you use this expression, even though you've never heard it before, or you heard it but you're not really sure what it means. By the same token, what kind of meaning is that carrying in your mind? And then of course there is coupled with, much easier to understand, because you know what a couple is. Two individuals coming together. So that one more clearly ties into the whole idea of what we're going to do, which is to show similarities. So now, by the same token, what could you say to show similarities and use the scenario that we're working with about school uniforms, yes or no? So, athletic teams and financial institutions wear uniforms to engender unity and pride among members. By the same token, students should wear school uniforms to engender school spirit. So do you realize what meaning is being conveyed there? You're showing the similarity between athletes who are on teams and they wear uniforms, as well as certain business houses that wear uniforms. You're comparing those, you're showing the likeness to children who are wearing uniforms. So the same idea that team spirit and team building is fostered through the wearing of uniforms, that idea is being conveyed into the premise of students wearing uniforms. So just the same way, a team of athletes, they work together as a unit. A group of students, because they're in the same uniform, will work together as a unit. Again, it's not necessarily true or false, but it is a valid point to raise. And you are showing the comparison. You're showing the similarities between these two entities. Now let's look at how you would use coupled with. So, infringement of freedom coupled with gross indoctrination are the underlying emphasis of those who support school uniforms. Now that's a very strong argument that is being made. So the similarity being shown, when you infringe on people's freedom, when you have gross indoctrination, what you're doing is the same as forcing students to wear a uniform. So they're showing the similarity between something that most, if not all of us, disagree with. I'm sure nobody really believes that you should take away anybody's rights and freedoms. So by bringing up that point, bringing up that issue, and likening it to wearing a uniform or being mandated to wear a uniform, then the same feeling of anger, dissatisfaction that you would feel about having your freedom taken away, the same feeling now is being transposed, being carried over into how it assumes you should feel about the idea of forcing someone to wear a uniform. So let's look now at phrases that emphasize, phrases that show emphasis. And when you're writing persuasively, a lot of emphasis will be needed at points, because remember, you're trying to convince someone who is not on your side. You have to attack it with that belief at all times. Whoever I am speaking to, whoever I'm writing to, is someone who is on the opposite side and they do not believe in what I'm saying. They do not agree with what I'm saying. So I must convince that person to join me in my rallying cry. So now, here are the typical words we would use to show emphasis. In fact, indeed, the obvious one, to emphasize, importantly, definitely, and never. So those are the words that we often fall on, the ones we often utilize, the ones we often rely on to show emphasis. So now let's look at some alternatives to these that can make the writing a little different. So you could use underscores. You could use the expression with this in mind. So remember now, you're showing emphasis and you are arguing either for or against the idea of wearing a school uniform. So how can you use underscores to do that? How can you use with this in mind to do that? Think of a sentence you could create that would emphasize something, whether a point to agree with wearing uniforms or a point to disagree with wearing uniform. Now remember, underscore, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that term. It's a little symbol on your keyboard, but maybe you didn't know that it actually has a meaning outside of that. But you can use the meaning that you understand to derive the meaning you may not understand, because the underscore does what? Think about the actual word and then think of the symbol. And then think of how you could use the idea conveyed now to create emphasis in your writing. So here's a possibility. The need for order and discipline, not only in schools, but also in the wider society, underscores the thrust to retain uniforms in school. What is the meaning being conveyed by underscore there? What is underscore emphasizing in that sentence? So look at it again. The need for order and discipline, not only in schools, but also in the wider society. So you are establishing that these are things that are required, not just in school, but in society at large. And because of that, the thrust to retain uniforms underscores this. So you're emphasizing that keeping a uniform is going to assist in this that you have stated. It's going to assist in having order and discipline in not just the school, but society at large. And that is a view many people hold. Whether or not that is actual fact remains to be seen, but it is a view that is popular. Now let us look at how you could use with this in mind. Everyone is entitled to freedom of choice by virtue of being born into a democratic society. So you have established a point. Now you're going to emphasize. With this in mind, abolish school uniforms. So what you have done basically is to show that we all have a right to be free and we all have a right to choose. And you are insisting now, you're emphasizing that when you keep that idea in mind, you should abolish uniforms because uniforms go against this. You're not necessarily choosing, it is chosen for you. So that is how you can use the idea to emphasize. You can use this phrase, this expression to emphasize the point you're trying to make. Now look at how you would use undoubtedly. How would you use it should be noted? How would you use this to emphasize something about wearing uniforms or not wearing uniforms? What could you say using undoubtedly to emphasize a point you're trying to make? What could you say using it should be noted to emphasize a point you're trying to make? Have anything ready? Of course, you have something ready, man. Something is in your mind. If it's not even on paper, it's in your mind. So let's look at what you could do. School uniforms are undoubtedly the single most effective means of stamping out any semblance of individuality among students. What have you emphasized in this statement? School uniforms are undoubtedly the single most effective means of stamping out any semblance of individuality among students. So right there, what side are you on? Wearing uniform or getting rid of uniforms? Based on this statement, you are obviously on the side of getting rid of it, because what you have emphasized is that the uniform, the idea, the concept of a uniform gets rid of any form of creativity. So what you're emphasizing is that creativity is nothing that is encouraged when you wear a uniform. All right, so let's look at how you could use the next phrase. So although there are many naysayers regarding the continued wearing of school uniforms, it should be noted that the very naysayers themselves wore uniforms and are none the worse for having done so. What point is being emphasized here? So look at what comes before the transition. Although there are many naysayers regarding the continued wearing of school uniforms, what does that mean? Who is a naysayer? Based on the tone, based on what is said, you can guess what a naysayer is, who a naysayer is. So, although there are a lot of people who are against it, so a lot of people are against a uniform, but then look at how you emphasize your point that those very people who are against wearing a uniform actually more than likely wore uniforms themselves. And they wore uniforms, they're still alive, they're still kicking, and they're still making up noise. So them having to have worn uniforms did not damage them in any way. So the point being emphasized, the general point, school uniforms are fine, but in this specific point now, you're showing that the very people who are against it used to wear it and they have lived to tell the tale. All right, so now let's look at another set of expressions. Without a doubt and evidently. Remember now you're trying to emphasize a point, and you're going to emphasize a point that is either going to support the wearing of uniforms or to oppose the wearing of uniforms. What can you say using without a doubt? What can you say using evidently? Think carefully. Without a doubt. When you say without a doubt, what is the meaning you're trying to convey? When you say evidently, what is the meaning you're trying to convey? Ready? All right, let's look. So without a doubt, the total breakdown of society will ensue if school uniforms are abolished. And notice now, what you're emphasizing. Once you abolish school uniforms, what is going to happen without a doubt? Because when you say without a doubt, you're saying it's inevitable. So if you abolish school uniforms, this point is emphasizing that society as we know it will cease to exist. It will break down, total chaos and disorder, possibly people just running around doing crazy things. We don't know. But that sounds as if that's the point being emphasized here. Now, how would you use evidently? So, evidently, wearing school uniforms will solve the nation's crime problem, as it has done such a stellar job thus far. Now, think back to when we looked at the various persuasive techniques and devices. Which technique is being used in that statement? So, yes, we're using the transitional expression evidently, but what is the actual figurative device, figurative expression, persuasive technique being employed? Listen again. Evidently, wearing school uniforms will solve the nation's crime problem, as it has done such a stellar job so far. You remember? Starts with S. Sarcasm. Good. Yes. Learning, man. We're learning. So the whole idea is you are going to be using your transitional expressions, but you're also going to be using your persuasive techniques and devices. So they're not isolated. They work together. So now let's look at phrases that you can use to add a point. So you've made a point and maybe you just need to add to it. You need to put a little more on it to make a little more impact. So typical phrases you would use to do that. Of course, the obvious one, additionally. Then also, of course, to adds a point as well. And you can say along with. So those are the typical ones you would use. And of course, We keep those in mind as we explore other options because we like having options. So look at moreover. Look at furthermore. What can you do with moreover to add a point to something? What can you do with furthermore to add a point to something? So think carefully now. How would you use these two expressions or either one of these two expressions to add a point based on either supporting or opposing the idea that school uniforms should be abolished? Ready now? Let's have a look. School uniforms do not guarantee safety. Moreover, they are likely to be the proverbial bullseye, causing students to be easy targets for criminal elements. What point have you added here? What have you said? So the first point you have made is that school uniforms don't guarantee safety. And what you added to it is that not only does it not guarantee safety, but what it does is actually make you into a target because somebody will spot you in the uniform and know that you're a schooler, as you would say, and of course come after you because you're supposed to be helpless because you're children. But I know better. You can defend yourselves. So the point you have added is that there is no safety in the uniform, and then you have brought in another point to show that on top of there not being safety just by wearing the uniform, it actually might put you in danger. So let's look at how you could use furthermore. Our children's safety should be our top priority. Furthermore, why would you believe a child is better off wearing a crop top than a tunic? So right here now, you have your original point that the children and their safety should be a priority, which we all agree. Children should be kept safe. And then you have added to that now the idea that, and notice now you're using a rhetorical question here. You have added the idea that would you really believe that your child is better off wearing this type of clothes as opposed to that type of clothes? So let that sink in, let that ruminate, because it's time for our final break. We'll wrap things up after this. Welcome back. Now, hopefully you're not just joining us because we have covered so many things with regards to persuasive writing and using transitional phrases and link words. So before the break, we stopped at using phrases to add a point, and we looked at using moreover and furthermore. So now we're going to continue looking at phrases that can be used to add a point. So another phrase you could use, aside from, or you could use besides. Now, keep in mind, it's not beside as in two things next to each other. It's besides. So it has a slightly different meaning, and we want to be able to use it in this context to add a point. Now, can you think of how you would use aside from to support or oppose the wearing of school uniforms? So you'd have a point and you're going to add to it using the term aside from. So let's have a look at how you could possibly do that. So here we go. Aside from the fact that some students already feel disenfranchised by virtue of harsh living conditions, there is also the issue of classism that will be compounded by allowing the wearing of casual clothes to school. Now look at that carefully. So what is the original point and what have you added? So notice it says aside from the fact that. So that is the original point. So perhaps you had made the point that some students, because of where they live, where they're from, they already don't feel like a part of the unit. So that is one issue as it is. But now, if you take away the equalizer, the uniform, then you are going to make it even more difficult for them to feel like a part of the unit. So you are compounding the issue. You're making the issue that much more difficult by taking away the uniform. So the point, they already feel away. And now you're going to make them feel even worse. You're going to make them the victims of classism, possibly. All right, so let's look at besides. There are many more dire social ills to focus on besides the possibility of abolishing school uniforms. So what is the original point and what have you added? Now in this case, the original point is really abolishing school uniforms and how it is that it is not necessary. And then what you have added is there are many other things that require attention, that need attention, more than you wasting time and energy or spending time and energy on whether or not students should continue wearing uniforms. There are bigger fish to fry. So the whole idea is there are so many other things to focus on. This is not something for us to beat up our gums about. All right, so now let's continue. Look at how you can use likewise, how you can use equally. What can you do with either of those two expressions to add a point that supports or opposes our concept that we're working with? Likewise, think about it. Likewise means what? I hope you've been using your dictionaries as we went along, You should be using your dictionaries. So let's look. Society functions by adhering to rules and crumbles when they are disregarded. Likewise, students function by adhering to rules and are negatively impacted when they or their peers flout them. So you have done what here? Which device are we using right here, by the way? You have established that society does things a particular way, and now you have shown the similarity between that and the fact that students need the same thing. So society functions by adhering to rules and crumbles when they are disregarded, and students function when they adhere to rules and are negatively impacted when their peers flout them. So you have used what? You have used comparison again. So notice how you use likewise now to not only do comparison, but to add to the initial point you're making. So you're strengthening the point that if you take away uniforms, you're basically, first of all, affecting the students, and on a larger scale, affecting society eventually. Let's look at equally now. How can you use equally to add a point? In what alternate universe is ensuring that children are adequately prepared for school and have access to quality instruction equally as important as what they choose to wear? So your idea is, why are we making such a big deal over wearing uniforms? Because isn't the more important thing that they are ready for school, they're prepared for school, and they have actual access to the teaching learning process? So right there, you have added to the point. So you're trying to make the point that uniforms are unnecessary, and you're making it by adding a point that there are other things that are more necessary than whether or not you're wearing a uniform. Other things that are more important, other things that matter more than whether or not you're wearing a uniform. Now, phrases that show examples, because you're going to be showing some examples as you write. So think about what would be the typical phrase to show examples. There's one very obvious one. And of course, there it is, for example. There's no more obvious example shower than for example. And then you have for instance, you have like, and you have such as. So look at these now. Notably or notable and specifically. What can you use these to do in your writing? How can you employ them to bring up the example that you want to show? So let's look at that quick. Within schools that transitioned out of wearing uniforms, academic performance has notably increased. So the example you're giving, schools that have transitioned out of wearing uniforms, the academic performance has improved. Is that really true though? And for specifically, academic performance cannot be specifically related to uniform wearing. So you're showing now that the performance is one thing, the uniform is another thing, and the two things are not necessarily interrelated the way we would like to think they are. So keep in mind, you want to show examples and you're using notably or notable, or you're choosing to use specifically to do this. Now, that's it for today's lesson. Class time resumes tomorrow at 9 a.m. with CSEC English. We'll be looking at reading comprehension, specifically poetry. Until then, keep safe.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.